You're listening to Girls with Grafts, a burn community podcast created by Phoenix Society for Burn Survivors, a leading nonprofit dedicated to supporting the burn community. In this podcast, we'll talk with burn survivors, share resources to help with supporting and improving burn recovery, and discuss how to prevent burn injuries. Here are your hosts, burn survivors and Phoenix Society's marketing team, Amber Wilcox and Rachel Anderson.
Hello and welcome back to Girls with Grafts. I am Rachel Anderson, one of your co-hosts of the podcast, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Amber Wilcox.
Hey there. I'm so excited to have you back, Rachel. I know we missed you while you were gone, but congratulations on your wedding.
Thank you.
We're excited to kick off today's episode.
Thank you. Yes, and now I may sound a little different. I'm coming off of a cold, so my voice is a little deeper than normal, it feels like today.
That cruise took her for a wild ride, right? With
Yes.
that cold. Well, before we get started today, I do want to send over a special thank you to our season 1 podcast sponsor, Pritzker Hagman. They were on just our last episodes. If you didn't get a chance while Rachel was out, we did talk with Pritzker. But today we have a very special guest and I'm super excited, and he's going to be live with us. If you have questions, definitely put them in the chat. But Rachel, do you want to introduce our special guest here?
Yes, I'm so happy to introduce Aaron Volpatti to the podcast. He is an author, cognitive performance and injury coach, speaker, retired NHL player, burn survivor, and a graduate from Brown University with a Bachelor of Science degree in human biology. A pioneer in cinematic visualization and athletic performance, Aaron's unique practice has helped athletes all over the world. He was born in Revelstoke, British Columbia, and he's a guitar aficionado and wannabe rockstar. He's a professional dabbler, spending his free time fishing, hunting, camping, golfing, playing squash, or learning a new musical instrument or language. He currently resides in beautiful Okanagan in British Columbia with his wife, Michelle, and his son, Finn. You can visit him online at aaronvolpatti.com or Twitter and Instagram at aaronvolpatti. So thank you so much, Aaron, for joining us today.
Wow, what an intro.
And Rachel, you did it beautifully, right? You're already worried about being tongue-tied here.
Nailed it. Thanks for having me, girls. I'm really excited to be here.
Yes,
so
we
awesome
are.
To have you.
And congrats on the wedding. I didn't know about that.
Thank you. Yes, you're my first podcast back. So, and we're live today, so it's double whammy here.
No fogginess allowed, right?
Yes. Well, Aaron, I know you talked to Amber a little bit more than me while we were kind of getting things ready to go for the podcast, but I just would love to know a little bit more about you and kind of how you got started with ice hockey. I know that's a big part of your story.
Yeah, I think like a lot of Canadian kids, especially, it's just ingrained in the culture. And I was on skates early as a 3-4-year-old kid in the backyard and the makeshift ice rink over the garden kind of thing. And that's just where it all started. I fell in love with it and loved it from a really young age, and played it ever since.
So Aaron, I know it's not in your intro, but I know this about you. You are actually a part of our burn survivor community. And if it's okay with you, can you just give us a little bit of an intro of how your injury happened and how you became a part of the community?
Totally. Yeah. So I was 19 and I was playing my second year in junior A here in Canada. So I don't know, for those of listeners who aren't familiar with how junior hockey works, there is a league in the United States called the USHL, which it would be very equivalent to that. So it's kind of right below NCAA, and that's like what you play in to get recruited to play at NCAA. And so we had lost out our season, and then this is almost coming up on 20 years ago now. Wow. I don't know what the kids do now, but back then, like, we would go party for a week, and that's just what we did. And I was like maybe a lot of young kids, maybe young men especially, I was an idiot, to put it lightly. I was like, I was the daredevil. I was doing stupid shit all the time. And yeah, so this year was no different. And I was a bit of a pyro, and I was always messing around with gas and fire. And, you know, it's all fun and games until someone gets hurt, obviously. And that's what happened to me. I was basically doing like a spin off a Molotov cocktail. And so I had 2 wine bottles full of gas in my like sweater pocket, like I'm wearing like the kangaroo pouch. And I was walking around the party, you know, I think a lot of it I was feeding, you know, a young ego that, you know, I like the adrenaline from doing these crazy things, but I think a lot of it was maybe attention from girls, or and I was just living that like fighter, literally like I was the fighter on the team. And I think I was feeding that ego, living up to that stereotype as like the crazy fighter guy, you know? And I mean, I can reflect on it now and realize that's maybe what was going on. And yeah, so I was gonna like blow these bottles up, and I was walking around, and all of a sudden I was soaking wet. So as I was walking around the party, the bottoms of the 2 bottles had hit and broke. So now I had 1.5 liters of gas spilt on my torso. And we had obviously been drinking and obviously not thinking straight. But so I know there's a fire, and I know I have gas on myself, and I know that, hey, I shouldn't get maybe too close to this thing. But I didn't respect the dangers of gas and of the vapors of the gasoline, right? And so I was a walking bomb, really. And yeah, I think like 5 minutes ish went by, and you know, I was like, I reek of gas. I'm just gonna toss this sweater off. And to this day, I don't know why I wanted to toss it in the fire. I think maybe I didn't want to just litter and leave it there, or you know, maybe I just wanted to like, hey, I'll just light this sweater on fire then. And I thought what I kept was a safe distance away, and gave it a toss and kind of gave the ground a kick. And it was just like a detonator cord to a stick of dynamite. It just kind of followed me up, and up I went. And my natural instinct, that fight or flight, kicked in, and I just bolted and I ran. And that was the worst thing I could have done, because I was pretty fast. And so I took off, and there was no water, there was no grass, there was no snow. It was like rocks and dirt. And so, I mean, I think the burn community is familiar. You can't put out a gas fire. And so, yeah, I don't know how long it was on fire for, obviously way too long. And yeah, you know, rolling around, running through the woods, and just trying to put it out. It wouldn't go out. And people always ask me, you know, what did it feel like? And I don't know about your girl's experience, or maybe our listeners' experience. That shock kicks in. Like, I was in no pain, right? I was in zero pain. There was a sense of panic for sure. I'm like, I'm literally on fire right now. And I know it's not good. Right. But there was this like really eerie peacefulness after, I don't know how long, maybe 15, 20 seconds. And I just remember feeling like really warm. And like I said, this odd peacefulness to the whole thing. And I feel like that's probably what dying feels like. Because yeah, I was in no pain. That came later, obviously. Sure. And at that time, that's when I finally got tackled from behind, and my friends had finally caught me, and then they, you know, smothered me, beat me with all their jackets and everything, and finally got the flame out. So that's how it all happened.
From there, you obviously I'm sure went to the hospital. Tell us a little bit about that recovery.
Yeah. So, I mean, unfortunately, we were out 30 minutes away from a hospital with no service. So yeah, that whole next 30 minutes might have been the worst pain of my life. Once that shock wears off. Right. And then we finally get to the hospital, and I run in. I mean, picture the emergency room of a hospital at like 2 a.m. right? I always joke, you probably have the guy that, you know, got the crap kicked out of him at the bar, needs like a couple stitches, and you maybe have a screaming baby. Someone's got chest pains, and then in runs this. I'm ass naked because nothing left of my clothes. I was on fire for too long, so I'm totally naked. I'm bleeding. I'm burnt. I'm dirty. I got rocks embedded in my skin, and I'm just screaming at the top of my lungs. And I can just imagine they were like, "Oh, okay, you can help him." And then they must have knocked me out because I don't remember anything after I ran in there, and like 10 seconds later it was black. So what happened was I was there. So this is in Vernon in British Columbia, smaller town, and where I played hockey. And I was there for 2 or 3 hours. They got me stable, and then I got airlifted to Vancouver. Woke up there the next day. You know, the first few days were very foggy in Vancouver. I don't remember a ton. I just remember being very confused as to why I was in Vancouver. And then the memories slowly started coming back, and I'm like, oh shit, like this is pretty serious here. So
right. And about how long were you in the hospital there, Aaron? Because it was in middle of training camp, right? Or you're training while you're in.
So it was right after the season had ended. So it was kind of just heading into our off season. So I was in there for 6 weeks. I mean, that's a big part of the story. I was told I would be in there for a lot longer than that. And that's where this whole journey with, you know, my experience with visualization and defying the odds, if you will, with the title. Yeah, I mean, we can get into that whole thing. Like, I remember my first debridement procedure, which I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with. I think it should be called torture more. But so I had my first procedure, like 3 days after I arrived there, and they hadn't really gotten a look at me yet, right? So they're like, you're pretty messed up. We're going to wait to this debridement procedure when we can get a look. So I come out of that procedure in a ton of pain, obviously. And he kind of relays, you know, the diagnosis, I guess you could say, of, hey, you're 40% second, third degree burns. You're really lucky that it obviously could have been a lot worse. Your face isn't going to be super scarred. I mean, not scarred. You're going to make a full recovery. We don't have to graft over your joints, but you have serious damage to your torso, legs, and right arm and hand. So I had my arm and hands in a cooler going to the hospital, and he said that saved my right arm and hand. Yeah. So he was like, we might need to bone graft your like arm and hand, which I was like, oh my God.
And not having a graft over your joints, I know is something that is, I know I didn't have many over my joints, but I know that they said the same to me of like, having it over your joints can be an extra added layer of healing.
And my grafts on my thighs literally stop right before my knee. So he's like,
mine do too.
Someone was really looking out for you.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, this sucks. I'm pretty messed up. I'm going to recover. What about hockey? That was what I'm thinking in the moment. And so for me, I was like, my NHL was the NCAA. I wasn't really that great of a hockey player. I was pretty good. I was above average, but like I scored 1 goal in my first year of junior. I'm not thinking about pro hockey at that point, right? And like I said, I was a fighter. That's what my role was. And so the NCAA wasn't recruiting fighters in hockey because you can't fight in college, right? So I'm like, I can just slowly add these layers to my game as the years go on. And so for me, I had 1 more year of eligibility left for junior hockey to try and obtain a scholarship. And I was confident I could do that with 1 more year, 1 more shot, and just add more layers, play more minutes, put up more points. So I asked the doctor, I said, we have camp in 3.5 months. I'm like, what does that look like? And I'll never forget the look on his face. And he kind of like, he just froze. And I could tell right away. He's like, this poor kid thinks he's going to be playing hockey in a few months. And he just said, listen, these recoveries take years, not months. He said, you're going to be in here for a while, like well into the summer, potentially. Let's just focus on your recovery and pain management, and we'll look at getting you in a pair of skates years from now, like in a non-competitive environment kind of thing. Right. Because there was a huge list of reasons, as you and the listeners would be familiar with, like that's the skin grafts, that maturation process is long. And they're going to be stiff and painful and itchy as hell, which I didn't realize at the time.
And they don't know how long it's going to take to heal. I mean, there's no answer, right, to healing. In most cases, it looks different for everyone, right? So what as quickly as I may heal may be very different for you.
Yeah. And I mean, just not being able to sweat from those areas, like at the time, if we're thinking close to 40%, like that could have major complications with heart rate. And infection was probably the biggest. They're like, the last thing you want to do is put that in under gross hockey gear I've never washed in my life. Right. And like you got to wear a full body suit for 2 years. Like the list just went on and on and on. And so my career was over at that moment. And it was kind of this, I was trying to balance these two different emotions. On one hand, I was like very thankful that I was going to be alive and make a full recovery and have some cool scars to tell my story maybe. But on the other hand, I'm like, what, like hockey is all I know at this point. What am I going to do with the rest of my life?
Right.
So I was really down and depressed about that identity being just, taken away so quick. And so that was my first 2 weeks in the burn unit, was dealing with, I mean, like I said, pain and just what the hell I was going to do with my life at that point. And so.
Yeah, we hear that from survivors all the time, of that kind of loss of identity, whether it's a hobby or a sport or, even just
career,
what you did for a day-to-day living.
Yeah.
A lot of survivors, whether even if they had their injury at work or they had something with their hands and now they can't do the same type of career that they had. So that's definitely not, we hear that all the time. So when did you get back to playing hockey? Did you go back later that year?
Yeah. So I'll try and keep it short-ish. I mean, this is the meat of the book, is about that journey. So I get a call 2 weeks in to my stay, and it's my coach in Vernon. And he said, trying to keep it somewhat light and find some sick humor in the whole thing. And he's like, how you holding up? And I said, well, not great. So to paint a picture, like, I'm bedridden, I'm wrapped like a mummy. My parents put the phone up to my ear, and I'm talking to him. He said, hey, I was just talking with the assistant coach of Brown University, and they're after this type of player. And he told me his exact words were, we want a guy to put the fear of God in the defenseman of the Ivy League. And that was what I did. I was like, I just punished defensemen on the other team, right? I didn't score goals.
So when you say fighter too, because I want you to be specific about this, I know what being a fighter means in hockey, because my husband is very into hockey, and I won't lie, we did look up your NHL, and my husband said to me, oh, he's a fighter. And I know what a fighter means, but do you want to tell those that may not know what being a fighter in hockey means? What that is?
Well, I mean, first of all, quick funny story. My son's just about 7, and so he like gets that I played, and he thinks it's cool. And when he was a couple years ago, he's like, Daddy, can I see like some YouTube fight or clips? And in my head, I'm like, there's like 1 goal on there and 100 fights. And I'm kind of like, okay, maybe don't watch like those ones. Daddy doesn't do too good in those ones. So maybe let's leave that one out. But there's definitely all over there for sure. But fighter in hockey, you can fight. And someone has to play that role. And part of that role is policing the game in a way where, I know that if I go run over their team's, one of their good players, I'm going to have to answer for that. So in a way, and like, I don't want to fight someone that's 6'4", 240 pounds, really. I'd rather not get punched in the face. So it polices the game and it keeps it safer in that sense. That might sound abstract to people who know nothing about hockey, but it really does. And it really does keep the game honest, and it can be used as a momentum change, right? Like if my team's down 2 or 3 goals and we're playing like shit, then, as a fighter, I can go out and, get in a fight with someone. And part of it is the momentum swing. And the other part of it is the team's like, this guy's literally trading shots in front of 20,000 people and getting punched in the face. Mm-hmm. And he's putting his body on the line. Like, we need to pick it up, kind of thing. So that's sort of how the role of fighting works.
I think some people go to hockey to watch the action that goes down. I know I do. I'm not going to lie.
It's an aggressive sport. Yeah, that's just that's just the reality.
So you were a literal fighter here, is what you're saying.
Literal fighter, and I mean, people. So it's funny because people ask me about my book, and they think that's what it means, and. It really doesn't. I mean, it works that way too. And that is a small part of it, but it's really about fighting for what you love and fighting for what you believe in and what is right. That's really what the fighter means. And and I happen to punch people in the face for a living too. But
so you're in the hospital, you talk to your assistant coach or you talk to someone who had mentioned Brown University. Tell us what happens next.
Yeah. So my coach says, just call him. I know you got the time. They want to talk to you. And so, I hung up the phone. My parents take down this assistant coach's number, and I call this coach from Brown. First time I'd ever heard a Rhode Island accent, which you don't, Amber, you don't really have one. Like,
I don't. And it's funny that my mom does. But folks tell me all the time, like, you don't sound like you're from Rhode Island.
No,
and I'm like, no, thank goodness.
I'd never heard one until this guy's. I called this guy. His name was Danny Brooks, and he was a character. And he's just like, Volpatti, brother. Like, it was pretty funny. Anyway, so it was left really open-ended. And he just said, we're really sorry to hear what happened. We wish you the best in recovery, and maybe we can see you play one day if it all works out. Both of us knowing that, like, that's as of now not a possibility because I only have 1 more year of eligibility, right? And that's how it was left. And I remember hanging up the phone. Well, my parents hang up the phone, and I'm just laying there, and I just remember getting really emotional and thinking, I've worked my whole life to talk to one of these guys. And it's finally happened, and look where I am. Like, look what I've done to myself. Right. And I remember I just started asking questions about that list we talked about of like, here's why you can't play. And I just started thinking like, those aren't good enough reasons for me. And I'm like, I'm not like everyone else. Like, if you're telling me it's going to hurt, it can't be worse than what I just went through. That was a little bit naive thinking because it was a long road. But I made a choice. And I think that's, for me in my life, it's really been empowering, and not just in this moment, but in a lot of other moments, to just make a choice. And I said, no, that's not going to be me. And I'm going to come back and play hockey, and it's going to be a really cool story. And I'm going to do it. I don't care if I get an infection and I'm going to almost die. I'll deal with that when it comes. And so I'm not advocating for anyone out there or family members to like not listen to doctors in the burn unit, but it's more the message is this injury doesn't have to define you and define the rest of your life, because I almost let it define what my life was supposed to look like. So that defiant attitude really, it served me well. And I just made a choice. And that's where people ask me, like, how did you discover visualization? And this is how, because I was bedridden in a burn unit. I couldn't move. So my mind was all I had. And for those weeks prior, it was just infiltrated with all the negative shit, and how much, I mean, you talk about pain, like that stuff takes hold of your mind, right?
Sure does.
And I just started, I flipped that, and I just started saying, well, if I'm going to do this, I need to start visualizing and thinking about where I want to go, because I can't do anything else right now. And it really unlocked this superpower in this different place in my mind. And and the pain started becoming different, and it became more manageable. I mean, the mind is a crazy powerful thing. And
especially when it comes to a traumatic injury like this one, right? So
totally. Yeah. And so, I mean, there's more to the story, but I end up getting out of the hospital after 6. So I got my graft surgery 4 weeks. It was supposed to happen earlier, but I kept getting bumped down because people would come in a lot worse off situation. Right. And which is fair. It just delayed the surgery for me. And once that happened, and at the time I was supposed to complete the first phase of rehab at the hospital. And I just remember, like, once I had this choice, this kind of fork in the road, and then I was going to play hockey, I told my dad, I'm like, you got to get me out of here. Like, I need to go home. The burn unit is, I always say, one of the most special places in the world, but it's also one of the most terrifying with some of those injuries that, I mean, oh man, I remember a few of the injuries that people had there, and it's not a fun place, right? And it's, for me, I'm like, this is not conducive to my recovery. I need to get the hell out of here. So I semi-jokingly told the nurses and my parents, I'm like, I'm gonna walk up. Well, I couldn't walk, but I'm gonna wheel my ass out of here. And so they agreed, and I think they were okay with opening up a bed earlier. And so 6 weeks, and I was out. And that's where the journey really started, it was definitely a long year. I mean, the doctors were right. I had no business playing hockey. I had all these complications leading up to and during that year. So it was a long road, but yeah.
Well, I think there's definitely a balance of, like you said, listening to your doctors and care teams, of not, over pushing yourself, but at the same time, not just sitting back and saying, oh, well, the doctor says I'm never going to play hockey again, so I guess I'm never going to play. Yeah.
Right. Totally. Yeah. And
and I think that's important, right? Because I know, like, for me, I also was in the hospital for a very short amount of time, Aaron, but it was because I wanted to get out. But then once I got out, I remember being like, oh shit, what did I do? Right. And I had my husband here to support me, but I also know, like, when you look at recovery, there were days where I was just complacent and said, I can't do it, so I'm not going to. Yeah. But having a support system to say, like, no, what is your goal? And giving me, and I hear that a lot of folks just feeling like when you find a goal of what you want to achieve after your injury, I feel like that does help, right? So for me, it was yoga. Like, I want to get back to doing yoga. So every day I sat on a chair and did chair yoga. And that was my end goal. And I think that I attribute that being the reason of why I was able to heal like the way that I was, because I fought, right? And I think it's a similar situation for you. Your end goal was to get back to hockey, to get back to doing what you loved. And so you fought hard to get to that place. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's having that guiding star. And I think the big part is the purpose and the why behind it. Right. And I wasn't willing to that was my dream, and I wasn't willing to let that go. And my mindset was literally like, I will die before I fall short of this. And I mean, again, I'm not advocating for people to push themselves that hard, but I did. And I would have never made the NHL without getting burnt. I know that. And so, these adversities in life are often disguised as a gift. Right. And so for me, I believe I got burnt to open up my mind to the power of visualization, because I know I healed faster in the burn unit because of that, and was able to get out of there sooner and, frame the pain differently and all these things. But my body fought back in every way possible. Like, I had kidney stones the day after I got out.
Oh, wow.
I got wheeled into the hospital in my wheelchair because I couldn't stand up for another 6 weeks after I got out of the hospital, because the blood would rush through those grafts in my legs. So it was like tensor, non-stick bandages, go for a 5-minute short walk like an old man, kind of, because I couldn't stand up straight, and then crawl around on my arms all day. And so so anyways, I got wheeled into the same hospital I ran in ass naked 6 weeks prior. And then I had to get an appendectomy 10 days before our training camp that fall, and they had to cut through my skin graft to get it. And it was just, my body was just being like, what the hell are you doing, man? Like, we're trying to recover from this major injury, and you're like working out and doing these things that we need to, chill. And I had
sometimes our bodies tell us what we're not willing to admit to, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But our body is the governor, right? And the mind runs the ship. And, that's what was happening. And I had this, so the season, I ended up playing in the home opener. And I mean, if you would have seen what I looked like under my hockey gear, like, people thought I was insane. Because those, I still had open 2nd-degree burns playing.
Oh, wow.
And the grafts were very fresh still. And yeah, like, the doctors were right. I shouldn't have been playing, but I mean, I look back, like, what if I would have listened? My life would be a lot different. And I got this really bad pelvis issue because I think the trauma to my thighs was so severe that I had this really bad instability. So, like, I was coming to the rink, to and from the rink on crutches. I could barely walk, let alone play hockey.
Oh my gosh.
But this is a long time ago. So back, 20 years ago, the player made the choice if they played or not. Like, if this happened today, I wouldn't be allowed to play today, because the doctors now have authority, and, like, especially with concussions and these things, and they would have said, no, you aren't able to. Right. And I probably wouldn't have had a choice. Back then, I made the choice, and I, like I said, was willing to die. So I'm like, shoot me up. This is when you could get shot up with any painkiller you wanted. So I was like, load me up and get me out there. And that's what I did. And as soon as I got that scholarship, it was hard to turn that switch off. But I'm like, I can't just be getting loads of Toradol and cortisone every day for like a year. And so I chatted with the coaches and the coaches from Brown once I committed, and everyone agreed, like, okay, it's time to get healthy here. You've done it. And so for me, I had to give myself that permission. It's like, you did it, now let's get healthy. And it took 2 years to fully recover. It did. So yeah.
It sounds like you learned a lot during that time, though.
I did. I definitely learned, that we're capable of a lot more than we think. And again, just the power of the mind and what we're really capable of.
So let's talk a little bit about, you going back. So I'm sure, like, returning to playing, your teammates and coaches, like you said, they thought they were like, what are you doing? Right. But in terms of how you kind of felt about your scars when showing them, I'm sure you had to show them whether you were changing in the locker room or getting out there in public, being able to show them in some degree. How did your teammates and your coaches kind of at first react? And do you feel like that may have changed who you were as a person after that accident, right? So you were always known as the fighter a little bit, right? So how did that change it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For me, like, honestly, I wore it as a badge of honor, because it was part of not only my physical self, but it was part of, like, in my mind, that injury had given me this, like, opened up this whole new world. And, I felt unstoppable after coming back from that injury and getting a scholarship to an Ivy League school. So I was on top of the world, and that's not to say I didn't get some interesting looks. I always joke with people, because bouncing around hockey teams, I mean, college, you're with generally the same people, except the new freshman class is coming in. But even just, in pro and turning, bouncing around teams, I always joke that I'd get some pretty interesting looks in the shower. But Yeah. Or I think, you know, kids, right? Because kids just stare and they tell you what's on their mind, you know, they don't. And so kids would always stare, and I don't know. It never bothered me in any way, because like I said, I had an association with my scars as a badge of honor. But I can tell you that if I would have, you know, succumbed or accepted that diagnosis, I think that would have looked a lot different. And maybe I would have had some, I don't know what the word, not a sense of shame isn't the right word, but, you know, just associating it with like a loss of identity maybe. And it's like the reason, and you have a different association there versus what I had. I don't know if that answers your question, but for me, the teammates they knew what I put my body through. No one else really did. So they saw behind the scenes stuff that was really going on, like me not being able to walk, and in the locker room debating like every day, can I do this? Is this worth it? What you're putting your body through, like all these questions, right? But it was interesting going to Brown, because, and that was a big part of the book, even with my closest friends and family, like no one really truly knew what I had gone through, really, like behind the scenes, because, you know, part of it was like the hockey culture as a man, I think in general, like we're not taught to be super open and vulnerable and talk about our feelings, right? So for me, I never talked about anything. And so everyone knew that when I went to Brown, they're like, oh, Pat, like my nickname was Patty. They're like, Patty got burnt and he recovered, and that's kind of it. That's all they knew, right? They didn't know the whole journey behind it. And
we talked a little bit about that, of like how as a man, sometimes you're asked to kind of toughen up, right? And our culture hides kind of like that emotional side of what you're actually going through. So I appreciate the fact that you're talking about that, because I'm sure there are other survivors out there listening that could probably relate to that.
Yeah, and especially having a burn injury, and whether it be like self-conscious, whatever you're feeling about your scars, and then you don't want to ever talk about it, like, right? That's just a recipe for disaster. And now I think, thankfully, that it's changed. I think we still have a ways to go, but now you're seen as strong if you're able to open up and talk, which is great.
And be vulnerable.
And be vulnerable. And that was a big thing for me to even start this book, because I was scared. I'm like, I'm going to really have to dig in here, and this is uncomfortable. Right. So yeah, that's definitely a big part of it.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing all of that. One thing I want to kind of dive a little bit more into is you're talking about this visualization. I know you talked about doing it in the hospital. Is that something you did, you know, once you were at home and once you were at college and playing, and do you still do it today? And can you just maybe tell our listeners a little bit more like what that means, or how maybe they could start?
Yeah, totally. So to answer your question, or the one question, when I got to Brown, everything went out the window, because I was like, I have reached the peak. There's nothing else after that. And I was naive, and I didn't have the wherewithal to think like, man, if I can do that, like what else could I do? And so I didn't visualize after that, because I had done what I set out to do. And so when I got to Brown, I just enjoyed, you know, being a US college athlete, and had fun. And I mean, I worked my ass off, and, you know, and had a pretty hard academic load, and worked hard, and all those things. But yeah, I just had fun. And when, I mean, my perspective on life had changed as well. So I was like, I'm just going to live it up, have a good time. And after my junior year, one of my assistant coaches came up to me, and he's like, have you ever thought about playing pro hockey? And I like just laughed in his face, because I was 24 at the time, almost 25, because I went to college late.
Right.
And he's like, I really think if you worked on your game, you could have a solid like 5-10 year career, like in the AHL, which is right below the NHL, and maybe even get a shot one day in the NHL. And I'm like, wow, okay, thank you. I mean, I've literally never thought about that.
Right.
And that's a big part of the story too. You know, I went home that night, and I was like, had another kind of light bulb moment, and I was like, hey, ding dong, what have you been doing for the last 3 years here? And I made a choice that day that I was going to play in the NHL. I said, I'm like, if I can do that and overcome the burn injury to come back and play hockey, why can't I play in the NHL? And so that's when I had to go back to the visualization piece, because I'm like, what do I know that got me there to Brown? And it was the visualization piece. So I said, okay, let's do this. And that's where I started coming up with the idea of the cinematic visualization. So directing my movie and playing it in my mind. And so I would just live in this other reality. And the important part of that, what I've, learned through some studies at Brown and experience and studies after, is that you need to create an experience when you're visualizing. You can't just, a thought is okay, but it doesn't evoke the necessary change, like in your brain, as opposed to creating an experience, because that's when you can start, your plasticity of the brain. That's where you start changing the connections, right? And it was just so powerful, and it almost transported me into this other reality. And then I was able to reflect back on the burn injury, and this visualization transported me into this other reality and out of my physical reality. Right.
So give me an example of like visualize, like you creating this cinematic experience. Like, tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah. So I would start with the beginning. So once I have this moment or epiphany or whatever, fork in the road, and I have to go back to the visualization, I literally frame it like a movie. So I would open it up. It's about 10 minutes long, and I'd have a soundtrack to it and everything. And I would open up with the beginning. So I'd think about, what are my first memories as a kid in hockey? And it was like playing on that backyard rink and pretending I'm in the NHL, right? And when you have that soundtrack to it, it really starts evoking this emotion and nostalgia when you start it with an opening scene like that. And then I would kind of fast forward through my childhood and hockey memories, good family memories, really quick. The beginning was like 30 seconds maybe. And then I would go to the burn unit, and then I would quickly replay that whole thing for maybe another 30 seconds, a minute. And that's where it would act as a segue where like I felt unstoppable, because I'm like, hey, if I can do that, I can do anything. And I truly believe that. And then I would go to where I was now, or currently, which was at college. And that's where I would insert these areas, which I call rehearsal imagery. So I would visualize myself on the ice executing, how I wanted to play in my mind over and over and over again. And then, that would be about another 3-4 minutes, say. And I would just imagine dominating every game and making the plays, scoring goals, because for me, I had to add that offensive part. So I would, insert that piece of just dominating every game on the ice, feeling good, feeling fast, feeling strong, and, again, creating that experience. And then I would end it with the NHL. So then I would imagine, having the conversation with my agent, signing, like physically and feeling the signing of the contract. And then the ending of my movie was walking down the tunnel for that first NHL game. I would see my parents in the stands, and we would all get very emotional, knowing like I was never even supposed to play hockey again, let alone play in the NHL, the best league in the world. And then I would always circle it back to that why that we talked about with, okay, why did I do this? Because no one said I could. And I set out to prove people wrong and myself right, and protect and fight for my dream. Like that was my why. And then it would kind of like turn black and the credits would roll kind of thing, right, in my head. And it honestly was so powerful. And that's why I'm so passionate about teaching it now. And the craziest thing about the whole thing was I ended up signing with Vancouver. Out of all the 30 teams, I signed with the Canucks. So I'm like, man, have I been like manifesting this my whole life and I didn't even know it? Like I was in the burn unit in Vancouver 5 years prior, in Vancouver, with never a thought about pro hockey, and my hockey career was over. And then 5 years later, I'm a member of the Canucks. Like it was all just so crazy how it worked out.
And it's full circle. So that's really
I think
cool.
The universe the universe just works in crazy, mysterious ways. And I mean, yeah, I think it's a cool story.
So from Vancouver, you went to the Capitals. Am I correct in that? Yeah.
Yeah.
And you did have an injury on the ice at the Capitals. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I did. I got hit from behind and I basically blew my discs up in my neck. So I was lucky. It could have been a lot worse. And yeah, I ended up getting a spinal fusion surgery that ended my career just like that.
Wow.
So unfortunately, it was only a 5.5-year pro career, which again, I'm
Still
really
very cool.
thankful that it happened. But I would have, in a perfect world, I mean, life's not perfect and things happen, as we know. And I would have liked to, maybe just been retiring now, but that's not how it worked out, obviously. And yeah, but I mean, that's a big part of my story too, is once that happened, then life really hit me. Like, so I have all this experience with, physical and mental adversity and grit and being a man and all this toughness mentally and physically. And then this happens. And so now I have that identity gone again. And now I know, so it was tough for me to again, turn that switch off. With my burns, I knew that I couldn't make the burns worse. It was more like, can you deal with the pain and the risks of infection? And for me, the answer was yes. With my neck, I eventually had to say, hey, if you keep doing this, and I could have played, you might have a broken neck or a double or triple fusion. And then now you're talking about will I be able to pick up my kids and shit one day? So for me, it was a really hard to again, turn that switch off. But after talking with those doctors, and I was also older, right? I was 30 and I was trying to start a family. My 20-year-old self might have felt differently. So I had changed as I gotten older, but a lot of it was, you can really have a life-changing neck injury here. So that was it. And then again, that identity gets taken. And for me, I was thinking about what the hell am I going to do for the rest of my life? And aside from the physical pain and discomfort that was after the neck injury, right? Dealing with that. But again, so where I'm going with this is then life happened. And my ex-wife, wife at the time, almost died giving birth to our first son. She was in ICU for 10 days. So we were trying to deal with that. My dad got diagnosed with ALS a month after that. And then I, within a year and a half, my life just went to shit in my mind. And so I was going through a divorce. My dad was sick. All these things happened. I was a loss of identity. I hit rock bottom. And I didn't know, going back to the physical and mental stuff, I could push through anything in that regard, but emotionally and spiritually, I was just an immature little boy in my 30s. And I didn't have the tools and I didn't know how to deal with all this shit that was happening. And so I hit rock bottom and I was just a mess. And I had a moment one day where I come out. So I had my son and he was 2 at the time. And I remember I was hungover because I had been drinking way too much. Like I said, I was in a bad spot. And 2 years prior, I was in the NHL, with no cares in the world and making good money. I was married and life was what it was supposed to be. And now I'm how the hell did I get here? And so I was drinking too much and whatever. And I had my son and I was really hungover and he was like, Daddy, let's go out and play. And I remember I just put on a show for him and I was like, Daddy's not feeling good, buddy. And then I just had another moment where I'm like, you said you would never do this. And I just I'm going to get emotional thinking about it. But yeah, I just said no more. And yeah.
How did you come through that? So what were the steps there that you just I'm sure that's an emotional journey in and of itself. So how did you come through with that?
Yeah, like I said, that was arguably a harder time for me than the burn itself, because I didn't know what to do. But yeah, so I had to go again. I made a choice, and for me, every time I've made a choice, I stick to it, and there's a lot of power in making that choice. And I just said no more. I'm gonna untie the shackles and move on, you know. And I had to go back to like, okay, what do I know? And it was this, and it was the visualization. So I said, okay, I'm gonna start, visualizing and rewriting my movie. What do I want my life to look like? And the craziest thing is, like, within a few months, like, I meet my now wife, and like life just changed. I mean, it took a few months, obviously, it wasn't overnight.
Right.
But so for me, like, and I tell people, like, visualization has, it's gotten me from the burn unit back to play hockey to college. It's got me to the NHL, and it's also saved my life. Because every time I've gone back to use it. And so now I have the wherewithal to be like, okay, dummy, like, this is something you want to just practice every day when things are good too, not just when things are bad.
Yeah.
Right. So now
that's so powerful. I know we talked with our team not too long ago, our mental health counselor, and she said that, like, even just meditation, right, is so good to practice even when you're not at your lowest lows, because being able to do that is a tool then. And to me, it's like, okay, that's why I think I was able to recover mentally very well from my injuries, because I was always practicing that meditation and yoga and like being able to fight through like what my mind was telling me. And I think so much we think about like I'm going to wait until things get really, really bad to find the help that we need, rather than practicing it all the time. Right. Like, kind of like riding a bike. If you don't practice riding your bike, you're not going to be able to keep going. So
no, totally. So now I know I practice it all the time now. Right. And my movie looks a lot different now when I visualize it, but that doesn't mean it can't be equally as beautiful and powerful. Right. So yeah, it's definitely been a journey, but like, every piece of greatness, like, whether it be professionally, personally, it's always been preceded by some really, really crazy adversity. And I don't think that's an accident. Right. So I think just for all the listeners, you can come out with a lot more power and look back one day and be thankful for the journey too.
Definitely. Well, I know we're running a little short on time, and I know you just recently published a book, Fighter Defying the NHL Odds. So I know you talked about, a lot of this you can probably read in your book, but can you tell us a little bit more about the book and where our listeners can find it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of given the overview of the story, but yeah, it's really my journey from the burn unit to the NHL and life after hockey and dealing with adversity and the power of the mind. You can find it on Amazon or on my website, aaronvolpatti.com. So a big why and reason behind the book, well, there's two. One was to give you a quick backstory on how this came to be. So right when COVID hit and we went into lockdown, I was still going through the identity thing, right? I worked in wealth management for a few years, and I didn't love that. And I left that and ended up doing an Ironman and raising money for ALS as, just
for
something, something to have purpose for again. So that ended, and then COVID happened, and I'm like, okay, what the hell am I going to do? I'm stuck inside now. And I went and meditated and visualized on this bench by our house that we live in. And and then this book came into my head, and everyone had always asked, told me, like, Patty, when are you going to write the book and like tell the story? And I'm like, maybe it's time. And I'm like, I can help people at the end of the day with this. And that was when I said it was a bit scary to think about, but I had to get out of my own way, I guess you could say. and just be okay with opening up and being vulnerable. So I made a decision that I was going to do that and write it. And the other part was, giving back to the burn community. And so we have 10 more days left, but we're donating 40% of all the proceeds back to the burn fund. And so that kind of comes with, my number in Vancouver was 54, and I was 40% second, third degree burn. So for 54 days from launch date, we're donating 40% of the proceeds back. So
that's really cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, like we talked about this before, I think it just really lines up perfectly. So, I mean, I think the burn community will really resonate with the story, obviously, and you'll support a great cause with it. And I mean, if anything, I promise you'll be entertained. So,
well, Aaron, so we have 2 final questions that we ask any survivor that comes on here. So I'm going to ask the first one, and then Rachel will ask you the next one. But I love to know about self-care. So you talked a little about visualization, but how does Aaron practice self-care? So practicing self-care as a man may look different than how I like to practice self-care. How do you enjoy self-care these days?
Music, playing guitar has always been my kind of escape, where I'm able to just not think about anything and just play.
Well, you did say want to be rock star, right?
Right?
So you do play guitar.
I do. I have a slight obsession with guitars and music, and my son is like really into drumming, and so now he's kind of reinvigorate. We have a band. Yeah. So I told him, I'm like, hey, if you ever get famous, don't forget about your old dad, because I want to be in the band.
Well, I tell you, music is very powerful, right? I'm sure. Have you always had that affinity for music?
Yeah. My dad taught me guitar when I was 11 or 12, and then I just became obsessed and just played it all the time and got pretty good. And and I mean, I loved music right from a young age. So and my experience with visualization and music, and I don't want to take up too much of your guys' time, but when fighting in hockey was not easy in the NHL, like I'm not a huge guy. I played at 6'1", 205 pounds. I'm fighting guys that are like 240 pounds and 6'5", and someone reframed it really well, or framed it really, really well, and said, it's kind of like, imagine the bully comes to you at school in the morning and says, I'm going to take you into the field and the whole school is going to be watching. I'm going to beat the shit out of you. That's kind of what it's like. And so all day, all you're thinking about is this fight. And you're like, well, I'm not going to back down, but I'm also like, I don't want to get the shit kicked out of me. Yeah. So for me, like I would always be thinking about the fight the next day, and like, oh, they got that guy. So for me, if I just went down and picked up my guitar, and I could just escape that. And so for now, and even now, I'm able to, when life gets real, I'm able to just pick up the guitar, and it just kind of resets everything. So
yeah, I think having an outlet is really important. I know for me, it's yoga, right? So if I'm having a rough week, I'll say to my husband, I just need an hour to be in my space with so I can relate, because I think that's a really important self-care tool, is whatever works, whether it's playing guitar, doing yoga, or, knitting, if that's what works to kind of get your mind out of where it's at, I think it's really important.
Yeah. And I think for me, the guitar piece, I held on even more after my injury, because that was in jeopardy at that point, right? With just what he said, like my right arm and hand were going to be like, I thought about hockey, but I also thought about guitar. I'm like, am I going to be able to play guitar again? So yeah, just held on to it even harder, I guess.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, our other question we love to ask everyone is, and we talk a lot about burn anniversaries, so I would love to know if you do anything special on the anniversary of your burn injury.
Oh, that's a really good question. I definitely call it the burn anniversary.
That's great.
Yeah, I definitely do. I don't have a tradition with it, though. I'm trying to think back to the first 5 years if I did anything. I think I just made sure I was around my family, I think, for those first 5 years. But Now you got me thinking that I need to make it more of a special day.
We've heard that too before
Yeah.
from some of the other people we had on the podcast. Well, I don't do anything
Yeah.
too special. I just always have a nice dinner with my family and friends.
Yeah.
But
And
it's
we
up to
didn't
you
talk
there.
about this too much, but I think like family is really important to me, right? And friends and
Yeah.
having a good support system. So I'm
Totally.
sure, you know, dealing with, I know your dad had ALS, but I'm sure during that time of your recovery, that's just so important that you have a
Yeah.
great support system. So I agree. I think having my family around me during that time is sometimes really, right? Those are the people that got me through when I was at my worst or saw me at my worst, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But yeah, I think the last 10 years, at least I haven't done much. I just say, hey, it's my burn anniversary. But now you got me thinking I'm going to make this day a little more special.
It's a birthday. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
And
for
mine,
me, it's like a
ironically, was
second
420.
birthday.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Ironically, mine was 420. Yeah.
Hey,
So,
Rachel and I are both April burniversary as well.
Oh, are you?
So
Yes.
yes,
What day?
April burniversary. I'm 4/4, and Rachel, you're 4/5, right?
No, I'm the first, so I'm April Fool's Day.
oh, really? Maybe we
Yes.
should all like get together and just have an April
Have an April burniversary day.
April burniversary month
That's right.
party.
Yes,
right.
I love that idea. I love a good
Yeah.
reason to celebrate. So
Yeah, I
Yeah.
never can turn down a good burniversary celebration. So
We'll have a campfire sans gasoline.
yeah.
you can play some guitar. Amber
Yeah.
can lead us through some yoga, and we're all
Right.
set.
Yeah, it'll be a very peaceful
Yeah.
burniversary day. Well, Aaron, I want to thank you for being here today. As we close out, I just want to take a moment and once again thank the season 1 podcast sponsor who we would not be here without today. So Pritzker Hagman Burn Injury Legal Team helps burn survivors and their loved ones pursue compensation and justice throughout the United States. If you have any legal questions for them, the attorneys at Pritzker Hagman are ready to help, and you can find out more at legaljourney.guide. Aaron, any final parting thoughts for any survivors that are maybe listening in on our podcast today?
Oh, putting the pressure on me. Yeah, I just, again, don't your burn injury define you and define the rest of your life. You're capable of a lot more than you realize.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It was honestly such a pleasure to have you on.
Yes,
we really
thank you.
appreciated your vulnerability today, and we hope to hear from you real soon.
Yeah, you bet. Okay, thanks, girls. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Girls with Grafts. If you are enjoying this content, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.